She told a black veteran to move, but what the pilot did next shocked everyone. He stood quietly at the airport gate, his back straight, jacket neatly pressed. The soft clinking of metals on his chest barely made a sound, but they told a story. One most people passing by never noticed. His name was Leonard, 78 years old, and he had seen more in one lifetime than most ever would. He wasn't there to be noticed. He never was. But that day, he would be. Just then, a woman's voice cut through the airport noise. "Excuse me, sir. You're standing in the wrong line. That's first class." The old man blinked, gently turned his head, and nodded politely. The woman didn't wait for a response. She looked at his worn shoes, his dark skin, and the faded army jacket, then stepped ahead of him without another word. The gate agent glanced at them both, barely lifting her eyes. The next moment, Leonard's boarding pass was quietly taken from him and exchanged for a different one. "You've been reassigned to coach, sir," the gate agent said in a tone that wasn't exactly rude, but not kind either. There was a mix-up. Leonard looked down at the new ticket, seat 23B, middle seat. No explanation. He just nodded. That's how it began. A small moment. One many might not have even noticed. But sometimes, what looks like a small moment isn't small at all. The terminal was crowded. Veterans Day weekend. Families rushed by with strollers, suitcases rattling on the tile floors, and flight announcements echoing above. But Leonard walked with a quiet calm, his bag in one hand, ticket in the other. He'd arrived early, like always. Years of military, life made sure of that. He watched a young mom struggling with a screaming toddler and an overloaded stroller. Without saying a word, he walked over and gently helped her open it. She looked at him with surprise, then relief. "Thank you," she said. "Really, most people just walk past." He just smiled and nodded, then helped her settle the child. From behind the gate counter, the same woman who reassigned him watched. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Soon, the announcement came. "First class now boarding," she called. It loud enough for everyone to hear. Her gaze scanned the waiting area like she was making sure the right people got on first. Leonard waited. He had paid extra for this seat. His knees didn't do well in tight spaces anymore, and he was going to a special event in D.C. An old friend was being honored, and he wanted to make it without back pain. He stepped up when it was his turn, but the gate agent frowned. "Sir, this seat doesn't belong to you." Leonard held out his original ticket, calm but confused. "Seat 2A, I bought it months ago." She didn't even check the screen. "That seat is reserved for our premium passengers. I don't know how this got through, but it's not correct. You'll have to sit in the back. It's more comfortable there anyway." People nearby shifted awkwardly. Some looked away. Others looked right at her, eyebrows raised. No one said anything. Leonard didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, accepted the new boarding pass, and stepped aside. He had learned a long time ago which fights to pick. He'd been through worse, much worse, in places with jungle heat and gunfire, in times when returning home didn't mean returning to peace. He had medals for what he'd done, but he never wore pride on his sleeve, only patience. As he stepped onto the plane and walked past the first-class rows he had saved up to enjoy, no one knew who he was. No one knew what he'd done. To most, he was just an old man in a coach seat with a quiet smile, but just a few rows behind him, someone was watching. A journalist, sharp-eyed and curious, noticed the interaction at the gate. He noticed the medals, the way the older man moved with quiet strength. He had seen soldiers like that before. In stories, in interviews, in war zones. He leaned slightly into the aisle and whispered to himself, "That wasn't just any man." 9 minutes later, the entire flight would know, and for the first time in decades, someone would finally stand up for Leonard. The plane. was filling up slowly. Rolling bags, shuffled feet, polite "excuse me," and the usual overhead bin dance. Leonard Mallister took his seat in row 23, right in the middle. A tight fit for someone who used to jump from helicopters into combat zones. But he didn't complain. He never did. He sat down with quiet dignity, tucked his jacket beside him, and rested his hands on his knees. Across the aisle, a man in his 30s glanced over at him. Sharp eyes, camera bag slung across his shoulder, the kind of guy who noticed things. A journalist. Though no one knew it yet. He'd watched the whole scene at the gate. Something hadn't sat right with him. The man leaned back, pretending to scroll on his phone, but his eyes kept drifting back to the old man with the silver-gray hair and the faded metals. There was something about Leonard. Something in the way he moved. Calm, measured, like someone who had seen everything and didn't need to prove it. Back in first class, the seat Leonard had originally paid for, 2A, was now taken by a man in a business suit already sipping his second drink, laughing a little too loudly about market trends and stock options. He never looked back. He didn't need to. Comfort was his default. Further up front, a young flight attendant named Kelsey was preparing for takeoff. She glanced at the manifest and frowned. She had noticed the same thing the journalist had. The name Leonard E. Mallister was clearly written next to seat 2A. But he wasn't there. She tapped her screen, puzzled. She'd seen things like this before, especially when Janice, the gate supervisor, was working. Janice had a reputation among the crew, firm, particular, and sometimes selective. Not by the book, but by her own book. Back in row 23, Leonard shifted in his seat. His knees already ached. He looked out the window as the plane pulled away from the gate. He wasn't thinking about what just happened. He was thinking about tomorrow, the memorial in Washington, an old friend, a fallen soldier, a promise kept after all these years. Next to him, a woman in her 70s introduced herself. She had kind eyes and a warm smile. "I saw what happened back there," she said gently. "That was wrong." Leonard smiled politely. "It's okay, ma'am." "It's not," she replied. "You didn't deserve that." He paused, then looked her in the eyes. "Ma'am, I've seen worse. What happened today? That's just a pebble in the shoe." She didn't press. She just nodded and patted his hand. Meanwhile, the man across the aisle, the journalist, couldn't let it go. Something was bugging him. The medals, the calm posture, the reassignment. He pulled out his laptop and began digging. Leonard Mallister, Vietnam, 173rd Airborne, he typed, slow internet. But he waited. A few rows up, another man whispered to his wife, "That older gentleman? He had a first-class ticket. I saw it in line." She nodded. "I saw it too. The gate lady just gave it away. Like he didn't belong." The mood on the Tao plane was shifting. Quietly. Subtly. Like the low hum of something building. In the cockpit, Captain Harris was running through his pre-flight checks. The name stuck in his mind for some reason. Mallister. Sounded familiar. He couldn't place it, but it tugged at something deep. A story his brother had once told. Something about a medic, a bunker. A name that had stayed with him for years. Back in row 23, Leonard leaned his head back. His eyes closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was remembering. Vietnam. 1969. The cold. Heat. The noise. The screams. The weight of wounded bodies. The smell of gunpowder and wet earth. He remembered crawling into a collapsed bunker. Going back again and again. Carrying men out, even after a bullet tore through his shoulder. He never talked about it. Not even to his wife. But it was all still there, in his mind. As clear as yesterday. Suddenly, the journalist's laptop dinged. A blurry photo popped up on screen. a much younger Leonard standing at attention as a medal was pinned to his chest. The caption read, "Leonard E. Mallister, Silver Star for Valor in Vietnam." The journalist sat up straighter. "Who are you?" he whispered. And what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the captain flying this plane owed this man his family's future. The man sitting in the tight middle seat had once saved 19 lives. One of those lives was the captain's brother. And in just a few more minutes, that truth would rise 30,000 feet into the air. Louder than any announcement, and this quiet veteran, he was about to be seen. The plane was now in the air, cruising smoothly above the clouds. Seatbelt signs were off, trays down, headphones on. A quiet rhythm had taken over the cabin, but row 23 wasn't quite at peace. Leonard Mallister sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap. He stared out the small window, watching the sky stretch endlessly in every direction. He wasn't thinking about the cramped seat, not about the reassignment, not even about the gate agent who never gave him a real explanation. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere long ago. Across the aisle, the journalist was still locked into his laptop. He had found more than a photo now. There were newspaper clippings from the 70s, brief, faded mentions of a brave medic who'd carried soldiers from a collapsed bunker under enemy fire. "Went back 6 times, one line read. "Severely. Wounded, saved 19 lives. Another article hinted that he'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but never received it. The reason? Bureaucratic decisions, the article had said. But anyone reading between the lines could see what had really happened. It was 1970. A young black soldier in a war no one wanted. Some medals were easier to give than others. Some names were easier to forget. The journalist sat back in his seat, staring at Leonard. The same calm face, the same eyes that had seen things others couldn't imagine. The kind of man history overlooks until someone chooses to remember. And slowly, others on the flight were beginning to remember too. The woman next to Leonard, who had spoken up earlier, was now telling the passenger beside her what she saw. At the gate. "He had a first-class ticket," she said, voice low but firm. That woman took one look at him and decided he didn't belong there. A few rows up, someone else nodded. "I saw it too. I didn't say anything, and now I wish I had." Whispers were starting to move through the cabin like a quiet wave. Back in the galley, Kelsey, the flight attendant, had her tablet open again. She scrolled down the passenger list, her finger stopping at Seat 2A, Mallister, Leonard E. ticket confirmed. Purchased 3 months ago, manually reassigned, 37 minutes before boarding, by gate agent J. Whitmore. She sighed. It wasn't the first time. She'd seen Janice make sudden reassignments before. Once it was a young man in a hoodie. Another time, a single mom with 3 kids. No policy, no system error, just decisions. This time it hit different, because this man, this quiet, kind, middle-seat veteran, wasn't just another passenger. He was someone. He had been through something. You could feel it. Kelsey glanced down the aisle toward Leonard. He was helping the woman next to him reach something from the floor. Even here, even now, still helping, still serving. She bit her lip. Something needed to be done. She turned to the other attendant in the galley. "Keep an eye up here a second. I need to speak to the captain." In the cockpit, Captain William Harris was staring out at the clouds, but his mind wasn't on the flight. It was on a name. Leonard Mallister. It echoed like a whisper from long ago. His older brother had served in Vietnam, a respected officer, had told stories when they were younger. Some he kept quiet until later in life. One story he told again and again was about a young medic who'd pulled him from a collapsed bunker, saved his life. That medic's name? Mallister? He'd said once. Leonard E. Mallister. Never seen anyone braver. Captain Harris sat forward in his seat, heart suddenly pounding. He reached for his tablet and opened a folder labeled Family Notes. Inside were bits of conversations he'd written down from years past, little things his brother had said over time, and there it was. July 69, Docto. Medic named Leonard Mallister saved 19 of us. Should have gotten the medal. Politics killed. It. The captain stood up so fast his co-pilot looked over. "You all right?" he asked. "I need to check something," Harris replied. He stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin, his eyes scanning every row as he walked slowly toward the back. When he reached row 23, he paused. There he was, older now, gray hair. Time had worn his shoulders, but not his presence. And in that moment, Captain Harris knew. This was the man who saved his brother's life. He didn't say anything, not yet. He just stood there for a few extra seconds, then turned and walked back up the aisle. It wasn't time, but soon, very soon. It would be, because the plane may have been 30,000 feet in the air, but the truth was just beginning to rise. Captain Harris paused halfway down the aisle. He scanned the rows slowly, but his eyes stopped when he saw him. Row 23, middle seat. There was no mistaking it. The eyes. The shoulders. The quiet presence. This was him, Leonard E. Mallister. The man his older brother had spoken about for decades. The man who, according to family stories, had pulled his brother out of a collapsed bunker while wounded himself. The man who should have worn the Medal of Honor, but instead wore silence. Harris stood frozen for a moment. What do you say to someone who saved your family? What do you do when the world has looked away from someone you owe everything to? He didn't approach, not yet. He turned and walked quietly back toward the cockpit, heart pounding, trying to catch his breath. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't in any airline manual. But something inside him said it didn't matter. In the back galley, Kelsey was waiting. She had screenshots now, evidence, the seating manifest, the timestamp of Janice's manual override, and the name of the reassigned passenger, Leonard Mallister. Everything backed up what she already knew in her gut. Janice hadn't made a mistake. She made a choice, and it wasn't the first time. Kelsey looked up to see Dev Taylor, business class. Passenger, tall, well-dressed, and black, approached the galley with a calm but serious expression. "I saw it," he said. The reassignment, the way she looked at him. "I've seen that look before." Kelsey nodded. She didn't even check the system. Dev leaned in. "What are you planning to do?" "I don't know," Kelsey whispered. "But I can't. Let this slide." Dev nodded once, then handed her a small business card. "I work in civil rights tech. This kind of thing. It doesn't go away on its own. It gets buried unless people like us speak." Kelsey tucked the card in her pocket. Just then, Janice stepped into the galley. Her smile was sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time in the back, Kelsey." Kelsey straightened. "Just checking on the manifest. There's been some confusion." Janice's voice lowered. "There's no confusion. There's procedure. And if you want to keep your position, maybe even get promoted to international like you wanted, you'll stop looking for problems." But Kelsey didn't back down. "Is that what you told Mr. Mallister too? That he didn't belong because of procedure?" Janice's face froze. "You think I didn't notice?" Kelsey added. "But other people noticed too. He had a ticket. You took it." Janice looked around, lowered her voice. "You're on thin ice, sweetheart." "No," Kelsey said quietly. "Not this time. You are." At the same moment, in the cabin, the journalist had returned to his seat. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened his inbox. He began typing a message, short but urgent. To Editor, Washington Post. Subject, urgent. Story. Developing mid-flight Vietnam vet, removed from first class due to race. Confirmed history of military heroism. Possible Medal of Honor and Justice. Details unfolding now on Flight 187 to D.C. Name, Leonard E. Mallister. He attached the photo of young Leonard from the military archive, along with a shot he'd taken earlier on the plane. Leonard in his seat, still calm, still dignified, still unaware the whole flight was starting to orbit around him. He hit send. Back in row 23, Leonard sat quietly, unaware that conversations were happening all around him. Passengers whispering, sharing what they saw, wondering why it felt like more than just a seating mistake. A few were visibly upset. One man stood and walked toward the galley to ask for the captain, but before he could get there, the intercom dinged. Captain Harris's voice came on, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 30,000 feet and all systems are operating normally. We'll begin our descent into Washington, D.C. in approximately 30 minutes. But before we land, I need a moment of your time for something personal." Heads turned. Conversations paused. I want to recognize a man seated in this cabin. A man most of you may not know, but someone whose actions changed lives, including my own family's. Kelsey in the galley looked up sharply. She already knew what was coming. 56 years ago, Harris continued, a young medic ran into a collapsed bunker in Vietnam, again and again, under fire, wounded, to save 19 men. One of those men was my older brother. Passengers turned to each other. Murmurs rose. People began scanning the rows. "That medic is with us today," Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "His name is Sergeant Leonard E. Mallister. And while this country may have forgotten to thank him properly, today we correct that." Gasps filled the cabin. Heads turned, eyes widened. In row 23, Leonard looked stunned. The woman beside him gripped his hand. Across the aisle, the journalist began recording. And up front, the businessman in seat 2A suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence, looking around in confusion. The captain stepped out from the cockpit. He walked slowly toward the back of the plane. And with every step, the plane grew quieter. When he reached Leonard, the entire cabin was watching. The captain stood tall, removed his hat, and gave a sharp, heartfelt salute. Leonard didn't move at first. He just stared. Then slowly, quietly, he stood, straightened his jacket, and returned the salute, eyes damp, hands steady. The cabin erupted in applause. Not polite clapping, not forced. A real rising wave of appreciation that came from something deeper than manners. It came from respect, from knowing, finally, that the man who had once carried so many on his back was now being lifted up himself, and all across the plane, strangers stood to their feet. Some cried. Others clapped until their hands hurt, and Leonard, still standing, whispered only one thing. "I never needed thanks. But I'll never forget this." The flight wasn't just headed to D.C. anymore. It was headed toward justice. The plane was quiet in a way most flights never are. Not from fear, not from turbulence, but from something else. Respect. Sergeant Leonard Mallister stood in the aisle as Captain Harris held his salute. It felt like time had slowed, like the cabin was holding its breath. Passengers had risen, to their feet, many wiping away tears, others simply placing hands over hearts. Finally, Leonard dropped his hand and nodded at the captain. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I did," Harris replied, his voice low but firm. "You saved my brother's life. Today, I owed you mine." Leonard glanced around. Dozens of people were watching, some with tears, some with disbelief. For a man who had spent most of his life unnoticed, it was overwhelming. He took a step back toward his seat, but Captain Harris gently stopped him. Your seat's waiting, Sergeant. The one you should have had all along. Leonard looked uncertain. We're already almost there, he said. No need to stir the pot more than we have. But this time someone else spoke up. Sir, with all due respect, said the woman beside him, her voice steady. You've been stirring pots your whole life. Just by showing up. The line made Leonard smile. From first class, the man who had taken his seat was standing now too, realizing exactly what was happening. He looked embarrassed, unsure. Then, without saying a word, he picked up his coat and moved aside. Passengers cleared a path as Leonard walked toward the front, led by Captain Harris. One by one, people reached out. A handshake, a word of thanks, a hand on his shoulder. Someone handed him a tiny American flag pin. Another pressed a handwritten note into his hand. He walked slowly, humbly, but with dignity that filled the cabin. When he finally sat down in seat 2A, the seat he'd paid for, the seat he'd been quietly robbed of, it wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about being seen. The flight attendant, Kelsey, knelt beside him. Would you like some water, sir? She asked. Leonard nodded. That would be nice, thank you. She brought him a chilled glass and added, just loud enough for him to hear, I'm sorry, sir. What happened? It wasn't right. He looked at her and gave a small nod. You didn't do it, but I appreciate you saying so. A few rows back, the journalist was still filming, not for fame, but for truth. He had already sent clips to his editor, and the video was gaining traction online faster than anyone could have imagined. Thousands of people were now watching. A quiet man reclaim his place, not just in a seat, but in history. Meanwhile, in the back galley, Janice, the gate agent, stood frozen. She'd watched it all unfold from behind the curtain. She could hear the applause, the whispers, the emotion. And she knew the attention was turning. Her actions were no longer invisible. Passengers were now murmuring her name. A woman said, That's the lady who took his seat. A man added, I saw her do it. No mistake. She made a judgment. Janice stepped out, trying to look composed. But the look said it all. There was no hiding from the truth anymore. Kelsey stood firm near the cockpit, eyes meeting Janice's as she walked forward. Janice's voice was tight. You've made quite the scene. Kelsey replied calmly. The scene was already made. I just didn't ignore it. Behind them, Dev from business class stood up and walked toward the front. He looked directly at Janice. You should know, he said, voice quiet but serious. I recorded the conversation at the gate, and I've already emailed corporate. This won't be brushed under the rug. Janice paled slightly, but didn't respond. Then came Ethan, the journalist. He stood, now camera in hand, not recording, just speaking. You saw him, he said. You saw his jacket. His name. You made a choice. Janice's voice cracked for the first time. It was just a seat. I was following policy. No, Kelsey said. You were following bias. And now the captain stepped forward again. Calm, collected, but with fire in his voice. Ms. Whitmore, he said evenly. I'm moving you to the jump seat for the remainder of this flight. Airport security will meet us at the gate. There will be a report. Janice didn't speak. Her face turned red, but the message was clear. This time, she wouldn't walk away without consequences. As she moved toward the back, she passed Leonard in 2A. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at her, but the silence said everything. Across the plane, passengers returned to their seats. But something was different now. People leaned across aisles, sharing small stories, talking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed. Some spoke of their fathers, grandfathers, men who had served but were never thanked. The flight continued its slow descent toward Washington. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the clouds. Inside, something far more rare was happening. Recognition, respect, redemption. And all of it began with one man, who refused to raise his voice even when the world tried to silence his worth. The sun was beginning to set as the plane descended into Washington, casting long golden shadows through the cabin windows. Below, the Potomac River shimmered like a ribbon of light. From his window seat, seat 2A, Leonard Mallister gazed out in silence. He didn't say much. He never did. But behind those steady eyes, a lifetime of memory stirred. 50 years ago, he had come home from war unnoticed. No welcome, no flags, no thank you. Just silence and shadows. But now, somehow, that silence had broken. Not by force, not by anger, but by truth finally being heard. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, collecting cups and straightening trays. But the mood wasn't routine anymore. People weren't just preparing to land, they were reflecting, whispering to each other, glancing toward Leonard like he was someone they wished they'd known longer. In the cockpit, Captain Harris leaned forward, speaking softly to the tower. He confirmed landing. He glanced at the empty seat beside him, the one where his co-pilot usually sat during this final approach. But this time, Harris had chosen to fly the descent alone, not out of ego, but out of reverence. This landing mattered. Back in economy, the journalist, Ethan, had packed up his gear, but he wasn't done. His video had already hit thousands of views online. Comment sections were flooding with reactions. That man is a hero. Shame on that airline staff. Why is this still happening in 2025? The world was watching now, and they weren't going to let this one go. Ethan leaned across the aisle to Dev, the businessman who had stood up earlier. I think we just became part of something bigger. Dev nodded. Feels like history opened its eyes mid-flight. The landing gear thumped beneath the floor, and the pilot's voice came over the speaker once more. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us. As we arrive, please remain seated. But before we exit, I'd ask you all for one more moment of recognition, for a man whose quiet service spoke louder than any announcement. A final round of applause rose from every corner of the cabin. Some clapped with hands, some with tears. Leonard didn't look around. He simply closed his eyes and allowed himself, maybe for the first time in decades, to feel seen. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. The plane slowed. The runway passed by in a blur of light and color. As they taxied toward the gate, passengers peered through the windows, but they didn't see the usual quiet terminal. They saw a small crowd gathering, people with flags, veterans in uniform, airline staff holding signs, news cameras. Ethan's message had spread faster than anyone imagined. Veterans groups in D.C. had mobilized. Reporters from 2 local outlets were already waiting, cameras ready. A young man held a sign that read, "Welcome home, Sergeant Mallister." Inside the plane, Leonard shifted in his seat. He noticed the unusual stillness. He turned to Kelsey, the flight attendant who had treated him with such quiet dignity. "What's all that?" he asked, a little nervous. She smiled, tears at the corners of her eyes. "That's for you, sir." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not used to this." "That's okay," she replied. "We're just catching up on what should have happened a long time ago." As the doors opened, the smell of airport air swept in, stale and cold. But it didn't matter. What came next was warm. Leonard stepped into the jet bridge, not alone, but flanked by Captain Harris and Kelsey. A respectful silence met him at first. Then someone began clapping, then another, then the whole terminal. Applause. Deep, grateful, loud, and real. Veterans saluted. Reporters pushed forward but were held back by airport security. Cameras rolled, phones lifted, and one voice cut through the noise, strong, female, and clear. "Sergeant Leonard Mallister. Welcome home, sir." Leonard stopped walking. His eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, but sparkled. He had waited decades to hear those words. All around him, strangers became witnesses. Not to a scandal, not to drama, but to justice, arriving late. But finally, clearly. One small child broke free from his mother's hand and ran up to Leonard. He was no older than 6, curly hair, tiny flag in hand. "My grandpa says you're a hero," the boy said. Leonard knelt slowly, knees aching, and looked the boy in the eye. "Tell your grandpa I said thank you," he whispered. "And tell him we all did our best." The boy nodded solemnly and gave him the flag. Nearby, Janice, the gate agent, was escorted quietly by airline staff toward a side exit. No applause followed her. Only silence. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. What happened on that plane was already out of her hands. Out of anyone's hands. It now belonged to the people watching. To the veterans who felt forgotten. To the passengers who finally chose to stand. To a country that had too often looked away. And now, for a moment, remembered. Leonard Mallister didn't ask for any of it. He didn't want the cameras. He didn't need the headlines. But that day, walking through the terminal, he walked not just for himself, but for every quiet hero who had ever been told they didn't belong. And just behind him, Ethan hit upload. The video title was simple: "The Man in Seat 23B." And within hours, the whole country would know his name. The story didn't end at the gate. By the time Leonard Mallister left the airport that evening, his face was already appearing on phone screens across the country. The video, a quiet clip of a pilot saluting a forgotten veteran, had been shared over 1 million times within hours. People were tagging their parents, their old commanders, their history teachers. Who is this man? Why wasn't he honored before? We need to fix this. News stations picked it up. First local, then national. Veterans groups issued statements. Schools played the clip in morning announcements. Within 24 hours, Leonard's name was trending. Not because he asked for it, but because truth, when finally seen, refuses to stay quiet. But Leonard? He wasn't thinking about any of that. He was sitting in a modest hotel room in D.C., polishing the same shoes that had once walked through the jungles of Vietnam. He didn't sleep much that night, not because of excitement, but because the ghosts were loud. They always were when memories rose too fast. He thought about the young men he'd carried out of that collapsed bunker. The letters he'd written home for the ones who didn't make it. The medal that never came. The friends who were buried without recognition. All he ever wanted was to live with dignity. And somehow, that day on the plane had reminded him he still could. The next morning, Leonard stood at Arlington National Cemetery in his old army jacket, the same one from the airport. His friend, the one he'd come to honor, was being remembered, finally, by a grateful nation. A folded flag, a trumpet, a quiet tear. But this time, Leonard wasn't just a guest. He was invited to speak. He walked to the podium slowly, unfolding a worn piece of paper. He didn't read from it, though. He looked up at the crowd of veterans, families, strangers, and began. "I never served to be thanked. I served because others needed help. That's what we do. We show up." He paused. And for a long time, I thought maybe that was it. That showing up was all I'd ever be remembered for. Or maybe not. Remembered at all. But yesterday, on a plane to D.C., something happened. A man I'd never met stood up. And so did everyone else. They saw me. He folded the paper and stepped back. That was all he needed to say. Later that week, Congress announced an official review of Medal of Honor cases that had been delayed, denied, or downgraded due to racial bias. Leonard's name was at the top of the list. 2 weeks later, the airline issued a public apology, not just in a statement, but in person. The CEO sat across from Leonard, shook his hand, and said words that actually felt like they meant something. "We got it wrong, and we're going to fix it." Janice Whitmore was terminated, quietly, but it wasn't the end for her. Months later, she began volunteering at a local shelter for homeless veterans. She didn't talk about the flight. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just showed up and worked. And maybe that was the start of something better, too. Kelsey, the flight attendant who had kept her head high, was promoted. Not for heroism, just for doing the right thing when it was hard. She now trains new crew members, and every orientation includes a simple photo. Leonard, standing tall in row 23. The caption reads, "Don't wait for permission to do what's right." As for Ethan, the journalist, his story won awards. But more than that, it changed his life. He stopped chasing conflict overseas and started telling stories at home. Stories of veterans, nurses, teachers, people like Leonard, people who carried the world quietly. Dev started a fund for minority veterans in Leonard's name. The first scholarship went to a young woman studying to become a trauma nurse. "Just like he was," she said with a smile. "A healer." And Leonard? He didn't chase the spotlight. He turned it down more than he accepted it. But sometimes he said yes. To schools, to small-town ceremonies, to veterans who needed to hear from someone who'd been through it and come out with heart, still intact. Years passed. The world changed. Social media moved on. But the story of the man in seat 23B never fully faded. Teachers told it in classrooms. Churches shared it in sermons. And every Veterans Day, the airline left seat 2A empty. A quiet tribute with a brass tag that simply read, "Reserved, for the one we almost missed." When Leonard passed away at age 91, his funeral was simple, just the way he wanted. No cameras, no speeches. Just the flag, the trumpet, the old jacket folded neatly on a wooden chair. But across the country, thousands of strangers paused that day. Some lit candles. Some visited memorials. Some just sat quietly, like he used to, and remembered. Because sometimes, heroes don't ask to be noticed. They just hope they made a difference. And thanks to one flight, one voice, and one quiet act of courage at 30,000 feet, the world finally told Leonard Mallister, "You did."